Dance for us, widow. Three brothers laughed it together, a joke that would cost the Corrigans everything, though not one soul in that saloon knew it yet. 40 men and a handful of hard-eyed women pounded the bar in time because in Cañon del Oro, in the autumn of 1886, a woman's shame was the best free show in the territory. Nobody looked twice at the quiet man in the corner nursing a whiskey he had never once touched. Before the sun rose twice more, every soul in that town would learn the stillest man in the room had killed more men than the other 40 combined, and had simply been waiting to be given a reason. Stay with me tonight, because this is a story about a widow named Ruth Callahan who came into that saloon owing a debt she never should have owed, and a stranger named Clay who did not raise his voice once until it mattered, and about the particular kind of courage it takes to keep your hands folded in your lap while your whole body wants to move, right up until the moment it doesn't. Tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are, because where I'm from, this is the hour we tell it best. I heard this story from a man who tended that bar for 11 years, and never once forgave himself for how long he waited to act. He gave it to me slow, the way a man hands over something he's ashamed of. So I'll tell it the same way. Not fast, not clean. The way it happened. Ruth Callahan had been a widow for 4 months when the letter came. Her husband, Daniel, had worked the Dorsey Mining Company's North Tunnel for 6 years, had gone down into that mountain every morning with the lunch pail his wife packed and a cough that got worse every winter, and had died in March when a support beam gave out 800 feet under the Santa Rita Hills. The company sent no wagon to fetch his body. Ruth had to hire one herself with money she didn't have from a man who charged her double because he knew she had no choice. What Daniel left her was a small house on the edge of town with a leaking roof, a garden that needed more hands than one woman had, and 4 months of unpaid back wages the Dorsey Mining Company owed him for the last stretch of work he'd done. $91. It does not sound like a fortune, and it wasn't one, but it was the difference between Ruth keeping her house through the winter and Ruth losing it, and she had gone to the company office 11 times to ask for it. 11 times the answer was the same. The paymaster was unavailable. The ledgers were under review. Come back next week. The 12th time, the clerk at the company office, a thin, nervous young man who would not meet her eyes, finally gave her something useful. The paymaster took his supper at the Gold Dust Saloon most evenings. If she wanted her money before the snow came, she'd have better luck finding him there than waiting on the office to open. Ruth did not want to go to the Gold Dust. No decent woman in Cañon del Oro went into the Gold Dust after dark, not because there was a law against it, but because everyone understood, without needing it said, what kind of evening waited for a woman who did. But there was frost on the ground already, 2 mornings running, and there was a hole in her roof the size of a dinner plate, and there was a debt that was rightfully hers, earned by a dead man's cough and a dead man's hands, and she was not going to freeze this winter because men in an office were too comfortable to open a ledger. So on a Thursday evening in late October, Ruth Callahan put on her one good dress, the gray one with the high collar that Daniel had liked, pinned her dark hair back the way her mother had taught her, and walked through the swinging doors of the Gold Dust Saloon with her chin up and her hands folded tight in front of her. Got carrying nothing but a folded piece of paper with her husband's name on it, and the amount the company owed. She was 28 years old. She had dark hair and steady brown eyes, and the kind of quiet, careful beauty that didn't announce itself, the sort men notice twice. Once when she walked in, and again a moment later when they realized. Grief had thinned her face some since March, but it hadn't broken anything in her that showed. Not yet. The Gold Dust Saloon was owned by a man named Ezra Voss, and Ezra Voss was the reason a decent woman walking through his doors alone was in more danger than she knew. Voss was somewhere past 50, soft in the belly and soft in the jaw, with small, quick eyes that were always doing sums, how much a man had on him, how much he'd drink before he stopped counting, how much trouble was worth letting happen if it kept the room entertained and the bar busy. Voss did not throw the first punch in his life, not once that anyone could recall, but he had let more cruelty happen under his roof than most outlaws managed with a gun, because cruelty in the gold dust. Voss's vice was that he had long ago stopped believing anything was his fault as long as his own hands stayed clean, and he polished glasses behind that bar the way other men might polish a rifle, with the same patient, practiced indifference to what it was for. And on that particular Thursday, at the corner table nearest the stove, sat the three Corrigan brothers, and the Corrigan brothers were the reason Cañon del Oro had learned, over the better part of 2 years, to walk soft and speak careful. Amos Corrigan was the oldest, 31, broad through the shoulders with a red-brown beard. He kept trimmed close and small pale eyes that missed very little. Amos's vice was cruelty for its own sake, not greed, not even real anger, just a hunger to see something smaller than himself flinch the way some men need a drink before they can sleep. He had run 3 families off land. His father had bought cheap from the bank after the panic, and every one of those evictions he'd carried out with a smile, because the smile was the point. He liked being watched while he hurt people. He liked an audience. Wade Corrigan was the middle brother, 28, leaner and quicker than Amos, with a nervous energy that never quite settled, and Wade's vice was cards, not the playing of them, which he was middling at best. Wade had cheated half the ranch hands in the county out of a season's wages at one point or another, and when they figured it out, which they eventually did, Amos was there to make sure nobody collected. Deke Corrigan was the youngest, 24, thick-necked and slow-spoken, and Deke's vice was drink, plain and total, the kind of drink that turned a young man who might otherwise have had some decency left in him into a fist, looking for a reason. Deke didn't plan cruelty the way Amos did. Deke just got loud, and then he got mean, and then somebody usually got hurt, and by morning he rarely remembered which part he'd done. Together, the 3 of them had made themselves the law in Cañon del Oro in all the ways that mattered and none of the ways that were written down, because their father, old Silas Corrigan, had been the largest cattle buyer in 3 counties before he died, and the money he left behind bought silence the way money usually does, not loudly, just steadily. One favor and one looked the other way at a time, until the sheriff found it easier to be elsewhere when the Corrigans were drinking, and Ezra Voss found it easier to keep pouring. Ruth knew all of this when she walked into the gold dust that evening. She knew it, and she came anyway, because a woman with a leaking roof and a debt that was rightfully hers does not always get to choose the safer evening. The paymaster, a narrow, sweating man named Beecham, was indeed at his usual table, and Ruth crossed the floor toward him with her folded paper in hand, past the bar, past the card tables, past the stove where the Corrigan brothers sat with their boots up and their glasses full. She had almost gotten her $91, almost gotten out clean, when Amos Corrigan's boot came down off the table, and planted itself directly in her path. Well now. The room's noise dropped the way it does when it senses something worth watching is about to happen. Look who wandered in off the street. Ain't that Danny Callahan's widow? Ruth stopped. She did not step back, and she did not step around him. Not yet. Not until she understood what kind of evening this was going to be. "I'm here on business, Mr. Corrigan. I'd be obliged if you'd let me pass." Amos smiled, the smile Cañon del Oro had learned to fear, the one that meant he'd found his evening's entertainment. Business. What kind of business does a widow woman have in a place like this? All by herself, dressed up so pretty. Wade had already turned in his chair, cards forgotten, and Deke had set down his glass with the particular unsteadiness of a man 3 drinks past good judgment, and Ruth felt the whole room's attention settle onto her like a hand pressing down on the back of her neck. "I'm collecting my husband's wages." Her voice held steadier than she felt. She'd practiced this, practiced it in the mirror at home, practiced not letting her voice shake no matter what these men threw at her. The company owes him $91 for work he did before he died. I mean to have it before I leave. He died owing plenty of men, plenty of things. It was a lie, and Amos knew it was a lie, and he said it anyway, because the lie served the moment. Man goes and gets himself killed in a mine, leaves his debts to his widow to sort out. That about the size of it? He left wages the company won't pay. Ruth tried to step past him. Amos's boot did not move. "I don't believe I'm done talking to you." Amos had gone softer now, and that softness was worse than shouting, because the whole room understood it meant he was settling in. Widow woman walks into a saloon alone, dressed like that, asking after money. A man's got to wonder what else she might be selling. The laughter started then, ugly and immediate, and Ruth felt her face go hot, felt something in her chest crack sideways. But she did not cry, because she had promised herself in that mirror at home that whatever these men did tonight, not in front of a room full of strangers who would only remember the crying, and not the reason for it. "I am not selling anything. I am collecting a debt. Dance for us, widow." The second time the words had been spoken that night, but the first time to her face, close, deliberate, and he reached out and took her by the wrist, not hard, not yet, just enough to make his point, and pulled her a step closer to the center of the room. "Go on, give the room a show, and maybe somebody'll take up a collection for you. Might make more than $91 that way." "Let go of my arm." Wade had risen from his chair by then, grinning, and he came around to block her other side, so that she stood pinned between the 2 brothers with the crowd pressing close on every side, laughing, some of them, and others just watching with the flat, useless silence of people who know a thing is wrong. Deke lurched up from the table too, unsteady, laughing the loudest of the 3, and reached out and caught the edge of her shawl and gave it a hard tug, and the stitching at her shoulder tore, and a gasp went through part of the crowd, not enough of a gasp to matter. "Please." She hated herself a little for saying it, because she had promised herself she wouldn't beg, and here she was, begging. "Please. I only came for what's owed to me owed. Everybody in this room's owed something, sweetheart. World don't much care." He gave her wrist a twist, not enough to break anything, just enough to make her cry out, just enough to make the point that he could, any time he wanted, do worse. "Now dance, or sing. Or tell us all what a widow's willing to trade for $91, and we'll see if we can't come to an arrangement." The room laughed again. Somewhere near the bar, A woman, one of the saloon girls, hard-faced and tired-eyed, looked away, because she had seen this kind of evening before, and knew better than to draw the Corrigan's attention onto herself by objecting. Ezra Voss, behind the bar, kept polishing his glass and did not look up, because business was business, and a room laughing was a room buying drinks. And near the far end of the bar, in the shadow just past the lamplight, one man sat alone, with a glass of whiskey he had not touched since it was poured, watching all of it with an expression that had not changed once. Not a flicker, not a tightening of the jaw. Nothing that would have told a careless observer that anything at all was happening behind those quiet eyes. Nobody in the Gold Dust Saloon had paid him any mind since he'd walked in 3 hours earlier. He'd taken the same corner stool he always took, ordered the same drink he always ordered, and sat with the stillness of a man who had made himself furniture on purpose, and that was exactly how he liked it. He was young, for the kind of man he was, early 30s, clean-shaven but for a few days' growth, dark hair under a plain gray hat, a face that women noticed and forgot they'd noticed because he gave them no reason to remember it. His hands, resting loose on the bar, were scarred across the knuckles in a way that told a story to anyone who knew how to read that kind of scarring, though nobody in the Gold Dust that night knew how. His name was Clay. Nobody in Cañon del Oro knew his last name, and if you had asked around 3 states over, in the places where his name carried weight, you would have found that almost nobody there knew it either, because the men who had survived meeting him rarely stayed curious for long, and the men who hadn't survived weren't asking questions anymore. He was not famous the way outlaws with dime novels written about them were famous. He was known the way a hard winter is known, quietly, by the people who had lived through one, and feared by reputation alone by everyone who hadn't. Clay had ridden into Cañon del Oro 4 days earlier for reasons that were his own, and he had spent those 4 days doing what he mostly did in towns he passed through, watching, mostly saying little, letting people's true nature show itself in the small, unwatched moments when they thought nobody worth impressing was looking. He had seen the Corrigan brothers before, twice, from this same corner stool, and he had already understood in the particular cold, patient way he understood most things. He watched Amos twist Ruth's wrist. He watched Deke tear her shawl. He watched 40 people in that room decide one by one in the small, silent negotiations people make with their own conscience that this was not their fight, and he felt something settle inside himself that had been unsettled since he rode in. Not anger, exactly, though there was anger in it somewhere. It was closer to recognition. He had seen this shape before, in other towns with other names on it, and he knew how it usually ended if somebody didn't put a stop to it early. But he did not move. Not yet. Because Clay had learned, the long, hard way, that a man who draws too early draws for the wrong reasons. And he needed, to see exactly how far this was going to go before he decided how far he was willing to go in answer. Somebody get the fiddle. Amos, delighted with himself, threw it out to the room. Widow's gonna dance for her wages. I am not going to dance. Something in her voice had changed, not weaker, but tighter, like a rope pulled to its last inch of give. I came here for money owed to my dead husband. If you won't let me collect it decent, then I'll leave, and I'll tell every soul in this county what kind of men the Corrigans are. Amos laughed at that, an ugly, delighted sound. Tell 'em, go on, tell the whole county. See who comes running to help a widow with no money and no husband, and no friends brave enough to walk in that door with her. He looked around the room at the laughing, watching, silent crowd. "Ain't nobody in this room gonna lift a finger, sweetheart. That's the thing you ain't figured out yet. This whole town knows better." And that was when it happened, the moment folks in Cañon del Oro would talk about for years afterward. The moment the bartender who told me this story still could not speak of without his hands shaking a little, even 11 years on. Because a chair scraped back from the corner of the bar, unhurried, deliberate, the sound of it cutting clean through the laughter, and every head in the room turned toward the sound, the way heads turn toward a gunshot, and the quiet man who had been furniture for 4 days stood up. Enough. He didn't say it loud. That was the thing the bartender always remembered best. Not loud at all, delivered in the kind of ordinary voice a man uses to order breakfast, and somehow that quietness carried further across the noisy room than shouting would have. The laughter died in patches, table by table, as the word rippled outward. Amos turned, still holding Ruth's wrist, and looked at the stranger with the particular contempt of a man who has never in his life been told no by somebody smaller than him. And Clay was not a small man, but he was not an especially large one either. "This ain't your business, friend," wasn't asking, "Let go of her arm, or what?" Clay didn't answer, that with words. He reached down, unhurried, and drew the pistol from his hip, not fast, not a show of speed, just a plain economical motion, the motion of a man who had done this 10,000 times and had stopped needing to prove anything with how quickly he did it, and he fired one round into the ceiling above the bar. The sound of it cracked through the room like the whole building had split, and every voice in the Gold Dust Saloon went silent at once, and a fine rain of splintered wood and plaster dust drifted down through the lamplight, and Amos Corrigan's hand let go of Ruth's wrist so fast it was as if her skin had turned to fire. Now, into the ringing silence. "Let go of the lady's shawl, too, both of you." He looked at Wade, and then at Deke, and something in the way he looked at them, flat, patient, entirely without heat, made both younger brothers take a step back without quite meaning to. Nobody in that saloon moved. Ezra Voss had frozen behind the bar with the glass still in his hand. Beecham, the paymaster, had gone the color of old paper. Amos Corrigan stood with his hand still half raised from where Ruth's wrist had been, and something was working behind his small, pale eyes. Not fear, yet not quite, but the first uneasy stirring of a man who has just realized he might have badly misjudged an evening. You don't know who you're dealing with. The certainty had gone out of Amos's voice. No, but you don't know who you're dealing with either. And that's the one that ought to worry you tonight. He didn't need to. He simply held Amos's eyes until Amos looked away first, which he did, and then Clay turned to Ruth, his tone gone quiet and matter-of-fact. "You're bleeding at the wrist, ma'am. Come sit down. I'll see you get what you came for." Ruth's legs did not feel entirely her own as she walked to the bar, but she walked, chin still up, because whatever else had happened to her that evening, she was not going to let this room see her collapse. Now, before we go further into what happened next, into who this stranger really was and what the Corrigan brothers were about to learn about the price of a laugh at somebody else's expense, tell me where you're tuning in from tonight and what the hour looks like on your side of the world. Some of you are just sitting down after a long day. Some of you are already half asleep, and that's all right too. This is a good story to drift off to, and a better one to wake up still thinking about. Settle in. We've got a ways to go yet. The room did not fully return to its noise after that gunshot. It settled instead into a low, uneasy murmur, the sound of 40 people trying to reconstruct, in whispers, whatever they thought they knew about the stranger at the bar, and finding they knew nothing at all. Ezra Voss came around the bar himself this time, sweating despite the October chill outside, and paid Beecham's ledger a very sudden and very close attention, and, within the quarter hour, Ruth Callahan had her $91 counted out into her hand in full, in coin. The Corrigan brothers did not apologize. Amos Corrigan stood by the stove with his jaw tight and his eyes on Clay's back the whole while, doing the particular arithmetic of a proud, cruel man deciding whether tonight's humiliation could be undone, because men like the Corrigans were rarely changed by a single evening. They were only ever delayed. Clay walked Ruth out of the gold dust himself, one hand light at her elbow, not because she needed steadying exactly, but because he had seen enough shock in his life to know it sometimes arrived a full minute after the danger had passed, and he did not want her legs giving out on the boardwalk in front of the whole town. Thank you. They were outside now in the cool dark, the noise of the saloon muffled behind the swinging doors. I don't know what I would have. She stopped. Her hands were shaking now that no one was watching to see them shake. I don't even know your name, Clay. Just Clay. Well, Clay, thank you. She looked back at the saloon, at the warm lamplight spilling out onto the dirt street, and something hardened in her face. Men like that don't forget being made small in front of a room. No, Clay agreed. They won't forget it. That's why I'm going to walk you home tonight, and why I'd like your permission to check on your place tomorrow, in daylight, where your neighbors can see and nobody can say different about it. Ruth studied him for a long moment in the dark. Why would you do that? You don't know me. You don't owe the Corrigans a grudge that isn't already yours. Maybe I don't, but I watched 40 people in that room decide it wasn't their business, while 3 men heard a woman who'd done nothing but ask for money that was hers. I've spent a long time in places like that. I know what happens to a town that lets that kind of evening become an ordinary Thursday. He looked at her, steady, unhurried. I'd just as soon it didn't become ordinary. They walked the quarter-mile to the small house on the edge of town, in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable so much as it was full of a day too large to talk through all at once. At her gate, Ruth turned to him. You're not from around here. It wasn't quite a question. No, ma'am. Are you going to tell me why a stranger just stood up in front of 40 men and drew a gun on the meanest family in this county? Clay was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, Ruth saw something cross his face that she would only understand much later, the particular weight of a man deciding how much of the truth a stranger deserved on a first evening. Someday. Not tonight. Tonight you should sleep if you can, and lock your door, and know that somebody's watching the road. He was true to that. Ruth did not see him, but twice in the night she woke and looked out through the gap in her curtain, and both times there was a shape at the tree line at the edge of her property, patient and unmoving, and both times she went back to bed a little less afraid than she'd been the time before. Word travels fast in a small town, and by the following morning everyone in Cañon del Oro had heard some version of what happened at the gold dust, the widow, the Corrigans, the stranger, the gunshot into the ceiling. Most versions disagreed on the details. All of them agreed on one thing. Nobody had ever seen the Corrigan brothers back down from anything, and last night all 3 of them had. The sheriff, a tired, compromised man named Purdy who had spent 2 years finding reasons to be elsewhere when Corrigan business was afoot, rode out to the gold dust that morning to ask Ezra Voss a few questions for the sake of appearances, and Voss, sweating again despite the cool morning, gave him the same account he'd given anybody who'd listened since the night before. A stranger, a drinker, quiet fellow, had caused a disturbance, fired a shot into his good ceiling. Voss did not mention what the disturbance had actually been. Voss's ceiling mattered more to him than Ruth Callahan's wrist, and that, more than anything else, told you everything you needed to know about the kind of man Ezra Voss was. Purdy asked around town for a description of the stranger. He got several: tall, medium height, dark-haired, quiet, dangerous-looking, ordinary-looking descriptions that agreed on almost nothing, except the stillness of the man and the speed of that one shot. And Purdy, who had ridden enough territory in his younger years to have heard a few names whispered around campfires, felt something cold settle in his stomach that he did not share with anyone. It was 3 days later, in the back room of the land office, that the name finally surfaced, spoken low by a traveling cattle buyer who'd come through Cañon del Oro on business and happened to overhear the description repeated at the boarding house supper table. The cattle buyer went pale, quiet fella, corner stool, drink, he don't touch, hat pulled low, scar across the left knuckles. That's him. The boarding house keeper nodded. Lord above, the cattle buyer set down his fork. Huh? You had the reckoner in your saloon, and didn't none of you know it? Nobody in that room had heard the name before, not as a name attached to a living, breathing man, sitting in their own saloon 3 nights running at least. But within a day it had spread through Cañon del Oro, the way fire spreads through dry grass. And by the end of the week, so the stories went, by a Texas Ranger captain who had once tracked him for 4 months across 2 territories, and never once gotten close enough to arrest him, only close enough to see what he left behind. The stories that traveled with that name were the kind that grow taller with each retelling, and it was hard, even for people who lived close to the truth of things, to say which parts were fact and which parts had been embroidered by campfires and dime novel writers hungry for a legend. But the bones of it were true enough, and the bones alone were enough to explain why 40 men in a saloon full of laughter. He had ridden with no gang, answered to no bounty office, and taken no side in any war worth naming. What he did, when he did alone, and he did it for reasons that were entirely his own. Sometimes for money, more often, in later years, for something closer to a debt he owed a version of himself that had died young in a fire on a ranch 300 miles from Cañon del Oro. Clay came to Ruth's door himself 2 evenings after the shooting, and gave her the truth she'd asked for at the gate, sitting across from her at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee he barely touched, in the same unhurried, unshowy way he'd made the Corrigans let go of her wrist. I grew up on a ranch in the Nations. My father ran cattle, honest work, small outfit, nothing anybody'd have looked at twice. I had a sister, Mary, 4 years younger than me. When I was 19, a group of land raiders came through wanting the water rights on our section, and my father wouldn't sell, because the water was the only thing that made the land worth having, and without it, we'd have starved slower than if we'd just handed it over. He turned the coffee cup a half-turn on the table, the only sign that the story cost him anything to tell. They came at night, burned the house. My father died trying to get my mother out. I was in the north pasture, too far to hear it start, and by the time I got back, there wasn't much house left, and there wasn't any family left, except Mary, who they'd taken, because a 14-year-old girl was worth something to men like that. Ruth did not say anything. She had learned in 4 months of grief that some silences were meant to be sat in rather than filled. It took me 11 months to find her. I found her too late to matter to the men who'd taken her. She'd already died of a fever in a camp 2 states over, buried in an unmarked grave I never did locate. But I found the men, all 6 of them, over the course of that 11 months, 1 at a time in 6 different towns, and I did to each of them exactly what the law would have done if the law had ever bothered to come looking, which it hadn't, because a small cattle outfit in the nations wasn't worth a marshal's time. He looked up at her then, and there was nothing boastful in his face, nothing that enjoyed the telling, just a plain, weathered honesty. After that I kept doing it. Not for money mostly, though I've taken money when it was offered and needed, for towns like this one. For women like you standing in rooms full of people who've decided it isn't their business. I'm not proud of everything I've done to get men to stop, but I've never once been sorry for stopping them. They're calling you the reckoner, she said quietly. Half the county's talking about it. Names don't much matter to me. Never have. A name's just a thing. Other people hang on you, so they've got something to be afraid of. He met her eyes. What matters is whether the Corrigans come back, and they will. Men like Amos don't absorb an evening like that one, and let it lie. He'll want it undone, and the only way a man like that knows how to undo a humiliation is with more of the same worse, until the story people tell isn't about his shame anymore, it's about yours. Then, what do we do? Because I won't always be standing in the right corner of the right room at the right hour, and a woman in this county needs to be able to stand for herself when I'm not. He started her the very next morning, out past the tree line where her nearest neighbor couldn't see and wouldn't gossip, with an old single-action Colt he'd carried spare in his saddlebag for exactly this kind of need. Ruth had never held a firearm in her life. Daniel hadn't kept one in the house, had always said a mine was dangerous enough without adding a gun to a home with thin walls, and her first attempts were clumsy, her grip wrong, her aim wide, the recoil rocking her back on her heels hard enough that she nearly sat down in the dirt the first time she fired. You're fighting it, patient, unhurried, the same voice he'd used on Amos Corrigan 2 nights before, though it carried entirely differently now. Don't fight the gun. Let it do what it does and just point it where you want the trouble to stop. That's easy for you to say, it wasn't always. Something in the plainness of it told her he meant it, not as comfort. I missed my first 10 shots at anything that mattered. Man who tells you different is lying to make himself sound better than he was. They worked through October into the first weeks of November, most mornings before the frost burned off, and something happened in those weeks that neither of them had entirely expected. Ruth's hand steadied. Her aim narrowed from wild to merely poor to, by the 3rd week, something that might reasonably be called competent. And something else steadied too, something harder to name, a kind of quiet trust that grew up between a widow who had buried her husband 7 months prior. That grief does not make a person weak, only careful about what they let matter to them again. There was warmth in it. Ruth would have been lying to herself if she'd said there wasn't. Something in the way Clay watched her steady her aim that had nothing to do with marksmanship. Something in the way she found herself listening for the sound of his horse on the road some mornings before she'd admit to herself she was listening. But neither of them said much about it, not yet, because both of them understood, without needing to discuss it, that whatever this was between them, would have to wait until the Corrigans were no longer a shadow hanging over every quiet morning they shared. Amos Corrigan, in those same weeks, was not spending his time healing from humiliation. He was spending it compounding rage into a plan. He'd sent Wade into the county seat to make inquiries, quiet ones, careful ones, the kind Wade was reasonably good at when cards weren't involved, about who exactly a stranger calling himself Clay might be, and it had taken less than a week for Wade to come back with a name that half the county was already whispering. 3 separate second-hand accounts of what the reckoner had reportedly done to men who crossed him, each account bloodier and more elaborate than the last. Most men hearing those stories would have taken the lesson they were meant to take and ridden on to easier ground. Amos Corrigan was not most men. Amos's particular vice, the hunger to be feared and watched and never ever made small, could not simply absorb a public humiliation and let it sit unanswered. Not even against a man half the territory was afraid of. If anything, the size of the legend made the prize of beating it larger. Amos began to see the reckoner, not as a danger to avoid, but as the single greatest humiliation of his life, and the only cure for that particular poison in Amos's mind. He would not do it alone, and he would not do it fair. Over the following weeks, using his father's old cattle-buying money, and the fear his family name still carried in certain quarters, Amos quietly assembled 9 hired guns from 3 different counties, men with reputations of their own, men who would not blink at riding against a legend if the pay was high enough and the numbers favored them. He brought in Ezra Voss, too, not as a gunman, but as a source of information, because Voss knew the comings and goings of the town, knew which nights Clay rode out to Ruth's place and which nights he stayed close to the gold dust, and Voss, who valued his ceiling and his profits over any decency he might once have possessed, telling himself it wasn't really his fault, since he wasn't the one pulling any trigger. Clay, for his part, was not blind to any of this. A man who has survived as long as he had survives largely because he assumes, correctly, that trouble is always gathering somewhere just out of sight, and he had spent enough of those October mornings not just teaching Ruth to shoot, but walking her property line. Noting the 2 ways in from the road and the one narrow game trail through the scrub behind the house that most men wouldn't think to use and that he intended to make sure nobody could use without being seen first, they'll come at night. It was the 2nd week of November, and the first real cold of the season had settled over Cañon del Oro. Amos isn't the kind of man who can stomach losing in daylight twice. He'll want the dark, and he'll want numbers, because that's the only way a man like that ever wins anything, by making sure the fight was never fair to begin with. How many? More than I can drop clean in an open yard. He said it plainly, because he had never once lied to her about the danger, not from that first night onward, which is why we're not going to give him an open yard. Over the following days, working mostly after dark so the preparations wouldn't be seen from the road, Clay and Ruth turned her small property into something considerably more dangerous to walk into than it appeared. Trip lines of taut cord, strung ankle-height between fence posts, rigged to a string of cowbells salvaged from a neighbor's barn, so that no approach from the tree line could come silent. A section of the front path dug out and refilled loose, so that a man riding hard toward the house at night would find his horse stumbling at exactly the wrong moment. Barrels of lamp oil positioned at the corners of the yard, ready to be lit fast and bright, turning the dark that Amos was counting on into daylight at the moment it mattered most, None of it was meant to kill by itself. All of it was meant to slow, to expose, to turn 9 armed men riding hard out of the dark into 9 armed men stumbling and lit and separated from each other, which was a fight Clay could work with. You don't have to be part of the shooting. The night before, both of them standing in the yard in the last gray light, looking at the traps they built together. You could ride to your sister's in the county seat until it's finished, and nobody would think less of you for it. I've thought about that. Every night this week, I've thought about it. She looked at the house, at the garden she'd kept through a summer of grief, at the roof Clay had helped her patch 2 weeks back on an ordinary Sunday afternoon that had felt, for a few hours, almost like peace. But this is my land, and my husband died so I could keep it, and I am done being a woman. Other people decide things around. If they're coming for this house, I want to be standing in it when they do. Clay looked at her for a long moment, something moving behind his quiet eyes that wasn't quite a smile, but was close kin to one. Then we'll stand in it together. They came on the 14th of November, a moonless night, with a hard wind out of the north, 9 hired guns and Amos Corrigan riding at their head, with Wade and Deke trailing at a careful distance behind, close enough to claim the victory when it came. Which told you, plainly enough, what kind of courage the younger Corrigans actually possessed. The first rider hit the trip line 40 yards out, and the cowbells rang out sharp and sudden into the dark, and in the half-second of confused shouting that followed, Clay was already moving low along the fence line, while inside the house Ruth stood at the window with the Colt steady in both hands the way he'd taught her. Breathing the way he'd taught her, watching the yard. The second and third riders hit the loosened stretch of path moments later, their horses stumbling hard enough to throw one man clean out of his saddle, and in the chaos of that, horses screaming, men shouting orders that contradicted each other. The whole careful plan Amos had built already fraying at the edges. Clay lit the first oil barrel, and then the second in the dark that 9 hired guns had been counting on to hide their numbers burned away into flickering orange light that showed every one of them clear as noon to a man who had spent 16 years learning to shoot by exactly this kind of light. What followed was not the kind of gunfight the dime novels like to write, all noise and glory. It was fast, and it was ugly, and it was mostly over within 4 minutes, because 9 men who had signed on for easy money against a man rumored to be dangerous discovered, in the space of those 4 minutes, Clay did not aim to kill where he could help it. He shot to disable, to put a man on the ground clutching a shoulder or a leg rather than a chest, because he had learned long ago that a corpse tells you nothing, and a wounded, frightened man tells you everything, and because some unbroken part of him still believed that violence used carefully was different from violence used the way the Corrigans used it. 4 of the hired guns went down wounded in that yard. 3 more, seeing the odds collapse and the fire spreading bright enough to be seen from town, threw down their weapons and ran for their horses. 2 more simply never got close enough to matter, tangled up behind their fallen companions. Amos Corrigan, though, did not run. He came in low and fast on foot once his horse had bolted, circling wide around the burning oil barrels, and it was Ruth, not Clay, who saw him first, a shape moving along the side of the house toward the door, toward the window where she stood, and she did not call out for Clay. In that instant, that this was the moment everything since October had been preparing her for. Amos came through the low side window with a pistol already raised, his face lit orange and wild in the firelight, and whatever he meant to say in that moment, whatever cruel or triumphant thing he'd planned to tell her before he fired, standing steady in her own kitchen with the Colt her husband would have hated, and the aim she'd built one clumsy October morning at a time, fired first. The shot took Amos high in the chest, and he went down against the doorframe he'd just come through, and the pistol he'd been carrying skittered across the floorboards, and came to rest against the leg of the kitchen table where, weeks earlier, he had once sat uninvited. He did not get up again. Clay reached the doorway seconds later, breathing hard, gun still raised, and found Ruth standing exactly where she'd stood to fire. The Colt still level her hands, for the first time in 4 months not shaking at all. He came through the window. Her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her. "I did what you taught me." Clay lowered his weapon slowly and crossed the room to her, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing that needed saying that the silence didn't already hold. Outside, the last of the hired guns were scattering into the dark, and somewhere beyond the burning barrels, Wade and Deke Corrigan, who had held back from the fighting exactly as their courage had always promised they would, were discovering that their older brother would not be riding home with them. By the time Sheriff Purdy arrived at first light, summoned by a neighbor who'd seen the fire from a half-mile off, the yard told its own plain story. The wounded hired guns, too injured and too honest once cornered, to lie about who had paid them or why. Purdy, who had spent 2 years finding reasons to look away from Corrigan business, found that he no longer had that particular luxury, not with 9 men's testimony piling up in front of him, and a dead man in a widow's doorway who had by every honest account gathered that morning broken into her home by force with a loaded weapon in his hand. Wade and Deke Corrigan did not stay in Cañon del Oro long after that morning. Whatever fear had kept the town's silence intact for 2 years evaporated the instant Amos was in the ground, because a bully's power, once its center collapses, rarely survives long on the strength of the two who were always following rather than leading. And within the month, both brothers had sold what remained of their father's holdings for whatever price they could get and left the territory for good, and nobody in Cañon del Oro shed any tears watching them go. Ezra Voss did not fare much better. Once the story of that night settled into its true shape, the debt Ruth had been owed, the humiliation the Corrigans had inflicted with Voss's floor as their stage, the information Voss had sold to help engineer the attack on her home. The town's patience for his particular brand of profitable indifference ran out all at once. Enough of his regular customers stopped regularing. Enough of his suppliers found reasons to delay their deliveries, and by the following spring, the Gold Dust Saloon had a new owner and a new name. And Ezra Voss had moved on to some other town, willing to tolerate the kind of man who polishes glasses while cruelty happens. The Dorsey Mining Company, for its part, facing the sudden unwelcome attention of a territorial newspaper that had picked up the story of the widow and the debt and the gunfight that followed, discovered a renewed and remarkably swift interest in settling its back wages promptly. 6 other families in Cañon del Oro, who'd been owed money by the company for months, found their claims processed within the week, which was, in its own quiet way, one more piece of justice that Ruth's stand had bought for people. Clay stayed through the winter. There was no dramatic announcement of it, no declaration that he was staying for good or staying for her specifically. That was not how a man like Clay operated, not after 16 years of never letting himself belong anywhere long enough to be found there by the kind of trouble he outran. He simply kept fixing what needed fixing around Ruth's small house, kept walking the property line most mornings out of a habit that had become something gentler than watchfulness, and slowly, without either of them naming it plainly, something warm and careful grew up in the space between them, not the rushed, urgent thing that grief sometimes mistakes for love, but something slower, tested by 4 months of danger and work and honest talk across a kitchen table, the kind of thing that has time to prove itself true before it asks to be believed. They did not marry that winter, and they both knew without saying so that they likely wouldn't come spring either, because Clay carried 16 years of enemies behind him, men in half a dozen states who still remembered the name Reckoner and still nursed grudges old enough to have grown teeth, and a man who loved a woman the way Clay had come to love Ruth Callahan did not, in his own careful reckoning, get to simply stop being hunted because he wanted to. To stay was to make her a target for every old grievance, still walking free. He told her this plainly, one night in late February, snow coming down soft outside the window. And she did not argue with him, because she had watched enough of what men like the Corrigans could do to know he wasn't wrong to worry. "I'll come back." It was the morning he finally rode out, the roof fixed, the garden fenced properly against the deer, the trip lines and the buried oil barrels long since dismantled because there was no longer any need for them. Not on any set day, I can't promise you a season or a year, but I'll come back when it's safe to, and I expect you'll still be here. Land held, roof sound, aim better than it was. Then you'll have a good life anyway. You've got the land free and clear. Now the wages that were owed you, a town that finally saw what kind of men the Corrigans were, and won't forget it soon. You prove that yourself, standing in that doorway with a Colt in your hands. I just want the choice of coming back to be mine to make when I've settled enough old business that I'm not bringing it down on your roof along with me. She walked him to the gate, the same gate where he'd first told her someday, not tonight, and she did not cry because she had promised herself once in a very different kind of fear that these men would not get her tears, and she found, standing there in the February cold, "Someday," she said, echoing him, and something in his weathered face came as close to a real smile as she had ever seen on it. "Someday," Clay agreed, and swung up into the saddle, and rode north out of Cañon del Oro without looking back, not because he didn't want to, but because a man who has spent 16 years surviving on discipline. Ruth Callahan lived in that house another 40 years, by every account I've ever heard, and the garden she kept became in time one the whole town admired, and she never did remarry, though not folks said for any lack of asking. Whether the Reckoner ever did ride back through Cañon del Oro in later years and what became of him after that is a story the bartender who told me all this either didn't know or wouldn't say, and I've never found another soul who could finish it for me. Some stories I've come to believe aren't ours to finish. They're only ours to carry a little further down the road before we pass them on. What I know for certain is this. On an October evening in 1886, a room full of 40 people watched 3 cruel men shame a grieving widow on a saloon floor, and every single one of those 40 people decided, in the small, silent way people decide such things, that it wasn't their business to stop it. It took one man who'd been sitting quiet in the corner the whole time, a man nobody had thought worth a second look, to prove that judgment wrong. And it took a widow with a borrowed pistol and 4 months of grief hardened into resolve to prove, in the end, that she'd never needed saving so much, as she'd needed somebody to stand beside her long enough for her own courage to catch up to what she'd always had in her. That's the story as I heard it, and as I've told it to you tonight, and I hope it sat with you the way it sat with me the first time I heard it by a fire not so different from this one. This has been a fictional story created for entertainment, and any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental, though I'll admit, some nights, sitting here with the fire going low, I find myself hoping somewhere out there in some quieter version of this world. If this story kept you company tonight, I'd be grateful if you'd like it, and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you were listening from, and what hour it was when the widow finally stood in that doorway and fired. Until the next one, friends, ride easy, and take care of each other.